The boardroom of one of the most powerful companies in the world was silent except for the sound of pens clicking and papers shifting. It was the kind of room where people measured every word, every breath, every glance. The billionaire CEO sat at the head of a long glass table, his silver watch glinting under the ceiling lights. Around him, executives in dark suits waited nervously, pretending to study their charts while secretly watching his every move. He was the kind of man people didn't interrupt, the kind whose presence alone demanded obedience. The meeting had been called to discuss record profits and new expansion plans, the kind of news that usually brought smiles. But beneath the surface, there was tension, the kind that no one dared to name. Then, without warning, the door opened with a soft click. Heads turned as a young woman walked in. She was out of place, far too young, far too calm, and most shockingly, wearing a bright red clown wig that looked like something from a child's birthday party. For a moment, everyone just stared. The CEO's brows furrowed, and one of the assistants rushed to stop her. But she kept walking, slow and steady, like she belonged there. Laughter broke out, uneasy, nervous laughter, as a few executives exchanged whispers. But the woman didn't react. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes sharp and focused. Without saying a word, she placed her bag on the floor, took a deep breath, and then, to everyone's shock, climbed onto the glass table. The room froze. The sound of her shoes against the table echoed like a challenge. "Who let her in here?" one of the board members shouted, half standing. She ignored him completely. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, far too calm for someone surrounded by men twice her age and power. "You all know him," she said, pointing directly at the billionaire. "But you don't know what he's done." Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The CEO straightened in his chair, his confident smirk fading for the first time. "Young lady," he began, his voice low. "This is not the place for—" She cut him off. "Oh, it's exactly the place," she said. "You've built this empire on lies, and it's time they know." The laughter stopped. Even the air felt heavier. Someone whispered to call security, but no one moved. Every eye in the room was fixed on her. The billionaire's fingers tapped once on the table, before going still. He tried to speak again, but something in her expression, steady, almost sorrowful, made him hesitate. No one knew who she was, or what she wanted. But one thing was clear. This was no prank. The clown wig wasn't a joke, it was a statement. And before anyone could react, she leaned forward, her voice steady and deliberate, and said, "I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to remind you." The room went utterly silent, for the first time in years. The man who thought he controlled everything had no control at all. The moment the girl spoke, the billionaire's expression changed from irritation to disbelief. His jaw tightened, and his polished composure began to crack. "Security," he said sharply, his voice echoing through the boardroom. Two guards at the door moved forward, but their steps slowed as the girl raised a trembling hand. "Wait," she said softly, and something in her tone made everyone freeze. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper, something that made even the guards hesitate. Slowly, she reached up and removed the bright clown wig. The curls of red fell away, revealing messy brown hair underneath. Her face looked too young to be carrying the kind of pain that was written in her eyes. She took a deep breath, and her fingers shook slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock felt deafening. "Do you remember this name?" she asked. Then she said it. Just one name. The sound of it seemed to cut through the air like glass. The executives looked at each other in confusion, but the billionaire went completely still. His hand, which had been halfway raised, froze mid-air. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. The girl tilted her head, watching him carefully, and repeated, softer this time, "You remember him, don't you?" Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. The guards stopped moving entirely. their orders forgotten. Something unseen hung in the air, a truth pressing down on everyone in the room, even though they didn't yet understand it. The billionaire swallowed hard, his throat tight. His face had gone pale, his confident smirk gone completely. For years, he had been untouchable, feared, admired, envied. But now, as he sat there in silence, he looked like a man haunted. He leaned back in his chair, trying to hide the fear spreading through him, but the girl saw it. She saw the way his fingers twitched, the way his eyes flicked toward the door, as if searching for escape. "How do you know that name?" he finally asked, his voice cracking ever so slightly. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her bare feet making faint sounds on the glass. "You should know," she whispered. "You said it last." A murmur spread among the executives, who were now more curious than alarmed. They could feel something powerful unfolding but didn't understand what. The billionaire looked around the room, his calm slipping completely. "Leave us," he said to his team, but no one moved. They wanted to know. The girl stood over him, her expression no longer angry, just sad. "You took everything from him," she said, "and you thought no one would remember." The silence that followed was heavy, too heavy. Even the air felt still. Somewhere deep down, the billionaire knew that this wasn't about money or revenge. This was about the one thing he could never buy, the past. And in that moment, surrounded by power and wealth, for the first time in his life, he was afraid not of losing his company, but of facing the truth he had buried long ago. The tension in the room deepened as security finally gathered the courage to move again. 2 guards stepped forward, but before they could reach her, the girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It looked fragile, yellowed at the edges, and worn from years of being held. "Stop," she said softly, and her voice broke in a way that made them hesitate. Slowly, she unfolded the paper and held it up for everyone to see. It wasn't a document or a photograph, it was a child's drawing. Crayon lines of red, blue, and green showed 3 stick figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl holding their hands. The paper was smudged with dirt, a corner torn away. But what made the room fall silent was the name written in uneven handwriting at the bottom, the same name she had spoken earlier. "You took everything from us," she whispered, her voice trembling. The guards froze. The executives looked around, confused. None of them understood what was happening, but they could see the billionaire's reaction. His face drained of color, his hand tightening on the arm of his chair as if gripping reality itself. For the first time, he looked small. Gone was the powerful figure who commanded boardrooms with a glance. Now, he was just an old man staring at a memory he thought he had erased. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly, his voice almost lost. She didn't answer. She just stared at him with the kind of pain that could only come from truth. "You remember," she said. "You just don't want to." The executives exchanged glances, unease spreading like wildfire. They'd heard rumors, whispers about how the company's first factory had burned down decades ago, how the insurance money had mysteriously funded the billionaire's rise. But those were just stories, rumors buried by time and influence. Until now, the billionaire's chest rose and fell unevenly. He looked at the drawing as if it were a ghost. "That was an accident," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The girl shook her head slowly. "You called it an accident," she said, "but you knew. You knew the machines were unsafe. You knew the workers complained, and when it happened, you didn't look back." She held up the drawing again. "You didn't even check if anyone survived." The truth hit like thunder. The executives froze, watching as the man they admired began to crumble. He had built an empire of glass, and now a single piece of paper was shattering it. She stepped down from the table, her eyes never leaving his. "You buried the truth," she said softly, "but I climbed out of it." The billionaire's lips trembled as he looked at her. The recognition in his eyes was clear now, the memory of a little girl crying beside the flames, the sirens, the guilt he had buried under success. Everyone in the room could feel it. The story wasn't just about business or money. It was about a sin that no power could erase. The past he had spent a lifetime hiding had finally walked into his boardroom, wearing a clown wig. The guards stopped in their tracks when the girl's voice broke. She wasn't yelling or demanding anything now. She was crying. Not the kind of loud, dramatic crying that people fake for attention, but quiet, trembling sobs that came from somewhere deep and real. Her shoulders shook as she wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I wore this wig," she whispered, her voice cracking, "so you wouldn't see how scared I was." The red curls of the clown wig lay discarded beside her, a bright, ridiculous thing that suddenly looked heartbreaking against the cold marble floor. "Because when you destroyed our home," she continued, her eyes meeting the billionaire's, "I was only 5, and I remember you smiling." The words fell like stones into the silence. No one in the room moved. The executives looked between her and their boss, trying to make sense of what they were hearing, but the billionaire's face told them everything. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted away for a fraction of a second, and that was enough. The crack in his armor had finally shown. She took a shaky breath and turned toward the rest of the room. "How many of you know who you're really working for?" she asked, her tone soft but sharp. "How many of you have looked into the past of this company you defend?" The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Some avoided her eyes. Others looked at the billionaire as if silently asking for an explanation. No one spoke. The quiet stretched longer, heavier, until even the hum of the air conditioning felt too loud. The billionaire straightened in his chair, trying to regain control. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, but his voice didn't sound like his own. It wavered, thin and fragile, like a man speaking through guilt. The girl gave a small, bitter laugh. "Don't I?" she asked. She picked up the child's drawing from the table, holding it up again for everyone to see. "You built your empire on ashes. You told the world you rose from nothing, but you forgot to mention what, or who, burned for it." Her words cut deeper than anger ever could. One of the younger executives, who had joined the company only a few years ago, looked down at the table as if ashamed. Another opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find any words. The billionaire's hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "That was decades ago," he said quietly. "You don't understand the choices I had to make." She stepped closer, her tears still glistening on her face, but her voice steady now. "No," she said, "I understand perfectly. You chose yourself." The simplicity of it hit harder than a shout. The billionaire's lips parted as if to reply, but no sound came out. Around him, the room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in with every truth spoken. The girl finally lowered the drawing, her voice softening again. "I wore the wig because I didn't want you to recognize me first," she said. "I wanted to see if you would deny me again." She took a step back and looked at him one last time. "Now I know." The billionaire looked down, unable to meet her gaze. The people who had once feared him now saw something different, a man cornered by his own past. And as the silence stretched on, everyone in that boardroom realized that the clown wig wasn't a disguise of mockery, it was a mask of courage. The girl's hands were still shaking when she reached into her bag and pulled out a small black device. It looked harmless, just a square of metal with a faint blue light at its center. The executives watched with confusion while the billionaire's eyes followed every movement, suspicion flickering in his gaze. Without saying a word, she pressed a button on the side, and the device came to life with a low hum. A faint shimmer filled the air above the table, and suddenly, light burst into shape. A holographic projection appeared, images spinning in slow, haunting motion. At first, the executives didn't understand what they were seeing. Then, the shapes came into focus. A building on fire, thick smoke rising into a black sky, people running in panic. The date stamped in the corner read 22 years earlier. Gasps filled the room. The billionaire's expression hardened, but the color had drained completely from his face. The hologram changed again, this time showing photos, reports, and official documents stamped with his company's name. Each one detailed the same event, a factory explosion that killed dozens of workers. But these files had notes scribbled in the margins, edits, deletions, falsified numbers. It was clear now the tragedy hadn't been erased by time. It had been erased by design. The room grew tense, the silence replaced by murmurs of disbelief. Executives leaned forward, eyes wide, reading the projected data, as if trying to convince themselves it wasn't real. "These are fake," one of them whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. The hologram shifted again, revealing the most damning image of all, a document signed by the billionaire himself, approving the closure of the case as an accident, even though earlier reports had warned of safety issues. The truth stood in front of them, impossible to deny. The empire he had built, the one they had all worked under, stood on the ashes of that fire. The billionaire leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, but his voice was weak. The girl didn't answer right away. She simply stepped closer, the light from the hologram casting her face in blue and white shadows. In her hand, she still held the old drawing, the one she had carried since childhood. She pressed it gently to her chest, her eyes never leaving his. "You made sure the world forgot," she said quietly, "but I didn't." Around them, some executives muttered in anger, others in disbelief. One woman covered her mouth, whispering, "My God." Another looked at the billionaire and said, "Is it true?" But he said nothing. His silence was louder than any denial could have been. The girl turned off the device, and the room was once again swallowed by silence. Only the faint hum of the air conditioner filled the air. She didn't smile. She didn't look triumphant. "I didn't come for revenge," she said softly. "I came for acknowledgement." Her voice carried no hatred, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying truth alone for too long. The executives looked at her with a mix of guilt and respect. For the first time, the billionaire lowered his head, the weight of decades pressing down on him, and in that single moment, surrounded by his empire, he realized that the one thing he could never silence had finally spoken the truth. The billionaire's body seemed to deflate as he sank back into his chair, his confidence collapsing like a building with its foundation ripped away. For years, he had ruled boardrooms, silenced rivals, and controlled every narrative that threatened his empire. But now, surrounded by the people who once admired him, he looked small, fragile even. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of his chair, eyes unfocused, staring at the ghostly glow left on the table from the hologram. The documents, the faces, the fire, everything he had buried under money and time, had clawed its way back to the surface. For a long moment, no one spoke. The executives sat frozen, afraid to breathe too loud, as if sound itself might shatter what was left of the man they thought they knew. Finally, his voice broke the silence, soft and uneven, stripped of all authority. "I didn't know anyone survived," he whispered, barely audible. His words hung in the air, fragile and unconvincing. It wasn't the denial of a guilty man. It was the plea of someone trying to convince himself of a lie he had told for years. The girl stepped down from the table, her movements slow but deliberate. The sound of her footsteps echoed faintly in the room. She stopped in front of him, so close he could see the tear stains on her face, the years of pain behind her calm eyes. "That's what you told yourself?" she said quietly, her voice trembling not with anger but with truth. "But you did know. You just didn't care." The words hit him harder than any accusation could. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow, searching for something to hold on to, an excuse, a defense, a way out, but there was nothing left. His empire, his reputation, his pride, all of it felt meaningless now. The room that had once felt like his throne was now a cage, and every person in it was a witness. Around them, the silence thickened. The executives, who had once nodded at his every word now, couldn't meet his gaze. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down at their papers, as if hoping to disappear into them. The tension was suffocating. The billionaire tried to speak again, his lips moving but no words coming out. His face looked older than it had. Moments ago, the weight of decades pressing into his features. He rubbed a hand over his face, the gesture slow, defeated. "I was trying to survive too," he finally muttered, but even he didn't seem to believe it. The girl shook her head. "You survived by stepping over others," she said, "and now you're standing on bones." No one dared to move. The air felt heavy with truth, raw, ugly, and final. The man who had been seen as a genius, a visionary, was now exposed as something far simpler, a man who had traded humanity for success. The girl turned away, her voice softer now, almost like a whisper to herself. "He thought no one would remember," she said. "But memories don't burn as easily as buildings." The billionaire lowered his head into his hands, the sound of his quiet breathing the only thing filling the room. And as everyone watched, they didn't see power anymore. They saw a man haunted by the ghosts he had created. For a long moment, the room was completely still. The billionaire sat hunched in his chair, his polished image gone, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to hold on to what little dignity he had left. His chest rose and fell unevenly, and his eyes, once sharp and commanding, now looked distant and lost. Everyone could see it. The powerful man who once seemed untouchable was breaking. Slowly, his breathing became heavier, and his shoulders began to shake. He tried to hide it at first, turning his face away from the board, but it was useless. Tears slid down his cheeks, quiet and unannounced. The kind that don't come from weakness, but from years of silence finally cracking. For so long he had buried his guilt under numbers, profits, and deals. He had told himself it was business, that success required sacrifice. But now, standing face to face with the only survivor of his greatest mistake, those excuses fell apart like ash in the wind. The people in the room looked on in disbelief, some in pity, others in quiet anger. The girl didn't speak. She stood still, watching him with an expression that wasn't cruel, but deeply tired. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, it was sorrow. She had imagined this moment for years, dreamed of the day he would see her and remember. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure, the final piece of a story that had haunted her since childhood. The billionaire finally lifted his gaze, his eyes red and glassy. His lips moved soundlessly at first, as though he was trying to find the strength to speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I remember his name." The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy at once. He swallowed hard and looked down at his trembling hands. "And I'm sorry." It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was real. The man who had once commanded rooms with confidence now spoke like someone confessing to himself, admitting the truth he had run from for decades. The girl's eyes softened slightly. She walked forward and placed the old drawing, the one she had carried all her life, gently on the table in front of him. The paper looked even smaller now, almost childlike against the cold glass surface. "Then make it mean something," she said quietly. Her words were simple, but they struck deeper than anything else that had been said that day. Around them, the room was silent, not out of fear, but respect. The executives who had once admired the billionaire now looked at him differently, not as a leader, but as a man forced to face himself. The billionaire nodded faintly, his voice gone, his tears falling freely now. The weight of what he had done finally caught up to him, and for the first time, he didn't run from it. He simply sat there, staring at the drawing that had survived where others hadn't. The girl turned to leave. her footsteps quiet, and for a moment, no one dared to move. They all knew they had just witnessed something more powerful than any business deal. The moment truth finally broke through the walls. Built by pride, weeks passed, and the city that had once bowed to a billionaire's name began to whisper a different story, not of power, but of redemption. The company's shining glass tower, once a symbol of prestige and dominance, now stood beneath scaffolding, its grand logo being taken down piece by piece. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing as news broke. The billionaire had resigned. No press conference, no grand exit speech, just a quiet statement, released to the world. He was selling everything, not to save face, but to fund the rebuilding of the small community destroyed so many years ago. The same town that had been erased from the company's history was now being rebuilt in its honor. Streets were repaired, homes were restored, and schools reopened with new names, ones chosen by the survivors. It was a story no one could have predicted, the fall of a giant who finally learned what it meant to stand as a man. The world watched in fascination. Articles called it the boardroom reckoning. Documentaries were made, and debates filled news panels. Some questioned whether it was guilt or genuine remorse that drove him. But those who had seen his face that day, pale, trembling, broken, knew the answer. He had been changed, not by shame alone, but by truth. The girl who had once stood in that boardroom had not returned, had not spoken to the press, and had not sought fame. In fact, she vanished completely, leaving behind only her courage and the story that had shaken the world's most powerful man. People searched for her, wanting to know her name, her history, but she never came forward. It didn't matter. Her voice had already done what it needed to do. The billionaire's empire crumbled, but in its ruins, something stronger was born. New companies began implementing ethical reforms, inspired by what had happened. Executives who once acted untouchable started questioning their own past decisions. Across industries, one phrase began to echo: the truth always finds its way. The scandal that had once been a headline had become a movement. Students studied it in universities. Activists used it as a rallying cry. And somewhere, far away from all the noise, the girl lived quietly, at peace with the knowledge that her pain had finally meant something. As for the billionaire, he didn't return to luxury or comfort. He visited the rebuilt town often, walking among the people he had once failed. Children who had lost parents in the fire now ran through streets named after them. He didn't expect forgiveness. He simply tried to make things right, one act at a time. And as the years passed, the story of that day in the boardroom became more than just a scandal. It became a legend, a reminder that even in places built on lies, one voice can break the silence. And sometimes, it doesn't take power, wealth, or status to change the world. Just the courage to speak the truth, even in a clown wig.